Thank you, everyone, for joining us for Nature Calls. I'm Jessica Mitchell, the Philanthropy Program Associate here at TNC Alabama, and Nature Calls is our virtual field trip where we get to share a new conservation project or a new look at a conservation focus in Alabama. Before we start today, it's a great program. I'm going to share with you a few housekeeping items. First, we are going to be recording this Zoom program. And second, I'm muting all of your microphones, and I ask that if you wish to make a comment or ask a question, that you use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. This will make it easier for us to manage the questions and answers at the end of the presentation. The presentation is going to be approximately 15 minutes long, with maybe another 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end. And now I'm going to start off by introducing Judy Haner, our Director of Marine Programs. In my opinion, she doesn't really need an introduction. I think most of us know her and love her. She's amazing. And she is going to take us through today's fantastic conversation with Steve Crockett. Judy, take it away.
Thanks, Jessica. You're giving me too much credit, but I appreciate it. And I'm really excited about today because in a roundabout way, Steve Crockett came to us, and I have just enjoyed so many days trying to find oyster drills off his dock and learning about him and his wife. And he became a trustee 2 years ago, has been just an incredible person in addition to what we have as our team. And I think what I'd like to do is start this discussion with Steve giving us a little bit of his background, because he didn't start as an oyster farmer, and then kind of drag us into how you got engaged in this, Steve. I mean, from your background all the way to the oysters on the Gulf Coast.
Well, I have a graduate degree in psychopharmacology. It was the 60s. And served on the ophthalmology faculty at University of Kansas Medical Center in the 1980s. Became a consulting biostatistician after that I just retired last March the 4th of 2020. And in 2000, Dema, my wife, noticed an advertisement or a blurb in one of the local newspapers about a volunteer program to be a volunteer oyster gardener. And this program was modeled after one in the Chesapeake Bay area. And the idea was to involve local residents who had access to the water in a reef restoration program. So we started there and received a bag full of oysters with a little set of oysters on the shells, and kept them under our boathouse. And there was a graduate student at Auburn working at the shellfish laboratory collecting data like growth rates and how much phytoplankton there was in the water, oxygen levels, that sort of thing. And it turned out from about 20 different sites, both sides of Mobile Bay, Dauphin Island, Coden, and our area, Grand in Sandy Bay, we had the best growth rates. And so we decided to see if we could do something with oyster farming. So 2001, we got some oysters from Scott Reichard at the Auburn University Shellfish Lab, and started growing oysters. We lost about 60,000 in Katrina. We weren't able to get back out to the site in time. They suffocated in the mud. And so about 2008, we had rebuilt out on the site on Point of Pines. And about that time, Bill Walton came along he's as assistant professor at the Auburn University Shellfish Lab. And he and his wife had done oyster farming up in Massachusetts. And so I guess the folks at the Shellfish Lab told him about us. So he came out and we did a year-long experiment where we used 4 different methods of growing out oysters. And the agreement was at the end, whichever one I chose, that I would get to keep the gear that was used in the experiment. So I chose the adjustable Australian longline method. It's a technique developed in Australia, South Australia, I believe. And some of the photos you'll see are implementation of that grow out method, where you have a pair of cables about 300 yards long, and every 10 feet, there are a pair of PVC pipes pushed down to the mud with hooks on them. And that allows us to adjust the height of the basket or the line relative to the water. So if you want to dry out the oyster to get fouling, oyster sets or barnacle sets or algae that's grown on the oyster, you raise them out of the water for 24 hours, that all dries out and they either leave the premises or they die. And then we could also lower them down at the to the bottom of the pipe during a storm, and the storm surge comes in, and most of the action is up top, out of the way of the baskets on the bottom. And when the storm's over, and we've had several storms, so it's a technique that works in our shallow bay. We raise them back up to about just the top of the average height of the water, and that seems to be working. You just let them grow.
I think the thing that I really like is that your farm is located in Grand Bay, an area that the Nature Conservancy helped protect. And I don't think we didn't know each other when we were protecting and when you were starting. So this is kind of an interesting relationship. But looking at the picture on the top right, Steve, about how many oysters are in each of those cages? How does that work?
Well, when we get oysters from the nursery, first of all, the oysters start out by at the laboratory in a hatchery, where the oysters are induced to spawn. So they're ripe with gametes. They're induced to spawn, and Scott Riker does some magic with the gametes, and they end up with fertilized eggs, which set on ground up chicken scratch, and it's graded to a size that only one larvae can set on. So you end up with single oysters. And so when we get an oyster, then they go to the nursery. The nursery keeps them for about a month and a half, and they turn out to be about 6 millimeters in size, and that's when we get them, the size of your little fingernail. And so at that point, we might have hundreds of thousands in a basket. Finer mesh basket than what you would see here. And as they grow, you have to thin them out and put them in a larger mesh container. And so when they get to the stage of putting them in these baskets you see on the line there, we stock about 75 to 100 per basket. So each line is about 300 yards long. So you're looking at maybe 30,000 oysters in each line.
Wow. I mean, that's a lot of oysters. So when I think about oysters in the wild, they're a little bit different than on these lines. What do you think the major differences are between wild oysters and the oysters that you're raising here through aquaculture?
Yeah, well, on wild oyster, a reef oyster, the larvae in that setting set on existing oyster shell that's on the bottom. And so you end up with clusters of oysters of different ages and different sizes. So when the guys who are tonging oysters, doing a wild harvest, they rake in, a bunch of oysters, and they've got to segregate off the smaller oysters from the larger oysters, and they get to keep the ones that are 3 inches or larger, and the rest of them go back on the reef. The difference between what that does and what we do is that all our oysters are single oysters. So when they get big enough to harvest, they're ready for the half shell market immediately.
That's perfect. I think we like eating oysters best, right?
Well, there's another advantage to the aquaculture method, is that they're never on the bottom. So you never get a muddy oyster from us.
That's good. That's really good. So you've seen this industry change over time, and if I'm correct, you were the very first oyster aquaculture operation in Alabama for sure, and on the Northern Gulf. Is that right?
Yeah, we say we're the first successful commercial operation, because Chris Nelson at Bon Secour Fisheries tried this back in the 90s over in Bon Secour Bay, and he was getting so much fouling from algae and the like that he was having to pressure wash baskets daily, and it just was too much of a headache.
Wow. So what are the major changes that you've seen since you've been into this? Because this has been since 2009, 2010. So you've been doing this for more than a decade. So you must have some lessons that, you know, you've learned over the years and some challenges that you've been able to figure out. You're kind of the sage helping the new folks coming into the industry learn from your past mistakes or your past lessons.
Yeah, well, I mean, we weren't the first. There's a long history to oyster aquaculture, mainly on the East Coast and the West Coast, and all in the Canadian maritime provinces, and in Australia. So, you know, we've taken from their learnings and applied them to our site. But yeah, it's labor intensive. So right now it would be difficult to hire. If you're going to do a family farm, it'd be difficult to hire somebody to do it. But if you have kids and mom and dad that can get out there and do the work, you can make a living doing this. Now, Murder Point oysters that the Zerlites are running, they're in the 6 million category. We're in the 300,000 per year category. So once you get big enough, then you begin to mechanize, and there are all kinds of mechanical aids to sorting oysters by their size, using video cameras and all that stuff, and it's highly mechanized. And some people use floating cages, but where the baskets are inside a cage with pontoons. And there are techniques by which you never have to touch an oyster basket, or never have to touch an oyster, because the collection of the basket from the water is automated. It dumps the oysters out of the cage into a chute, and it goes down a conveyor belt, and so you can imagine how that would work.
Wow. So lots of different changes that have come over time. So not to be biased, but what do you think the best oysters are? Why are they so good? Why has this been such a success on the Gulf Coast? And how are you marketing these?
Well, there's a term, if you're familiar with wine tasting, there's a terroir that the taste of the wine is associated with where it's grown and the region it's grown in. Well, somebody coined the term merroir, so that's the taste of the merroir, the sea that the oysters are grown in. So our site in Sandy Bay, which is a branch of Grand Bay at Point of Pines, usually has the right amount of salt. The salinity is about in the mid-20s, or low to mid-20s most of the time. And I like an oyster with reasonably good salinity, and I think a lot of other people do too. And the meat that comes from these oysters is firm. It tastes sweet and with a little salt, and it's pretty good with a squeeze of lime or lemon, or just plain.
Yeah, I'm kind of a little bit of lemon and not much else. Those oysters are good enough just to be, you know, eaten straight up. You're right. Well, seeing what you've seen over time, what do you think the aquaculture industry on the Gulf Coast is going to look like in, say, 10 or 15 years?
Right now in Alabama, we have about 15 families raising oysters. This is just the way we're doing it. Now, there are different grow out techniques. I use the adjustable longline method. Other people have cages sitting on the bottom, maybe on something to keep them off the bottom, but they're sunken. Others use floating cages and other means. So right now, it's, you know, what I wanted to do was to raise a branded world-class oyster for the half-shell market. So, you know, I've sort of got my name on it, and that's the way most of the other farmers feel too. They've got a branded product that they're associated with, and that's good when you're getting started because you're really invested in it. But at some point, I think there'll be a consolidation where, and this has happened in other areas up in Massachusetts and in state of Washington, where growers get together and they form a co-op, and they start, rather than competing with one another, they're cooperating with one another to get their oysters out on the market. And I can see that happening. Some consolidation is likely to occur.
Well, so, I mean, across the last decade and a half of doing this, there has to be some defining moment, some memorable point in time, you know, that kind of sticks with you as a grower. Can you share one of those with us?
Well, back early on, Whole Foods was a long story. There was a food event at Gulf Shores, and as an outing is associated with that event, grocers and chefs and retail people were involved in that event, and so they had a side trip where they were offered the opportunity to come over to our farm and visit. Well, only one couple showed up, and it was a cold November day, and they were in shorts actually, and we went out on the pier, the boathouse, and started eating oysters and got involved in a conversation. So we invited them up to the house for a glass of wine with some oysters, and turned out she worked for Whole Foods in outside of Birmingham. I can't think of the name right now, but so she got me involved in selling oysters to Whole Foods, and that was pretty rewarding to go to stores. And we went to Memphis, Nashville, several other Whole Foods stores, and they had our oysters on display with a picture of us and the farm, and that was pretty rewarding.
That is outstanding. I mean, I can't even imagine. I always get really excited to tell people, and I haven't been, but apparently there's a restaurant in Five Points that carries your oysters up in Birmingham. So you can be in Birmingham and you can still get Point of Pines oysters. Is that right?
That is right, and that's Chef. I can't think of his name right now, but I've met him. We have oyster events all over the Southeast, and he's participated in a number of them. In fact, we've eaten at his restaurant too.
That's great. Well, so Steve, can you tell us the story of how you got involved with TNC?
Yeah.
Kind of a strange little turn of events.
Yes, serendipity. So TNC had acquired the last tract of a purchase near where I live, near Point of Pines, and they wanted to celebrate by having the governor come out to an event on site, and it turned out the site was my site. So we packed in, oh gosh, probably 40 people were preparing for that event, you know, spraying bug spray to keep the bugs down. We do have bugs out there, and brought a truck out with a trailer and put up a tent. Governor came, dignitaries spoke, and then we had lunch after that, or brunch, I guess it was.
Yeah,
and
that was great.
Shortly after that, Roger and Elizabeth and a few other folks paid a visit and got me involved with TNC.
That's fantastic. So we're always looking at partnerships and ways that we can, you know, add value to operations that use Mother Nature, obviously, you know, the good water quality you've talked about, but also can benefit these livelihoods. So do you have any ideas on ways where TNC can help support stuff with, you know, operations within the industry, where partnerships can be strengthened between maybe aquaculture and the Nature Conservancy?
Well, let me say that starting out in 2009 with permitting to start an oyster farm, it was complicated and fairly expensive. We had to get a permit approved by the U.S. Corps of Engineers, ADEM, the Coast Guard. We had to have navigation aids out. So the permitting process was quite laborious and like I said, expensive. But since that time, since getting started, we've had like department commissioners of the state senators and representatives, representatives from the industry, representatives from academia visit our site. And since then, the legislature has streamlined the application process and made it very, very easy now. And so it's been very helpful to have those partnerships and to work together on this. It's really been amazing. I mean, even the city council in Biola Battery has gotten involved. So
well, how can we help tackle some problems or challenges that you have?
Probably, I mean, TNC is good at establishing partnerships. And so working with other people interested in the program and pulling each of these different parties together is probably a good way to go.
Great. Well, I think at this point, what I'd like to do is see if anybody else has questions, because Steve is a wealth of knowledge on oysters and aquaculture. He's been around the block with this, and coming from his psychoanalyst background, he actually can get into the mind of an oyster. So he might be able to give you some insights that not all growers can actually give. Jessica, can you unmute, or can we have folks raise their hand or ask a question?
Yes, so if anyone has any additional questions, you can type them into the chat feature at the bottom. Or yes, like Judy said, you can click that raise hand icon next to your name into the participants list. But the first question we have is actually, how exactly are you marketing your oysters? You did mention Whole Foods, but is there anything else you're doing?
Yes, in Alabama, if you're a grower, you have to market your oysters through a certified Alabama shellfish processor. And so this is all tight. We can get into the regulations, but so we sell to Crimson Bay Seafood in Biola Battery. We also have sold to Chris Nelson, Bon Secours Fisheries in Bon Secours, Alabama. I think we've sold some oysters through Johnson Seafood Products and a few other processors in the Biola Battery Codan area. But mainly it's Crimson Bay Seafood, because they're right there local. And what they do is they market our oysters. They sell them to restaurants, to probably our biggest outlet is through Evans Meats in Birmingham. And they go all over the Southeast. So we're in Atlanta, Nashville, Knoxville, Louisville, Memphis, Oxford, Mississippi, Montgomery, Birmingham, places like that. We don't make it over to the East Coast, however. So the problem is that since I'm not marketing, I don't know where my oysters are going until I ask my processor, well, where are they going? We've actually participated in oyster events and met somebody from Chattanooga that had been serving our oysters for several years. We never heard of the guy.
Wow.
Wow. We do have another question. It's a little bit broad, but can you talk about the importance of oysters? And Judy, you might be feeding in on this one as well.
Well, oysters do have services to the ecology, sequestering nitrogen from the water, providing habitat for other creatures. So we get little worms on our oysters, hopefully not in them, just on them, and little crabs and fish can grow up inside the basket as long as they leave before they're too large to get out. So it's an incubator of sorts. We had once thought that the calcium carbonate that's in the shell would be useful for sequestration of carbon dioxide. But it turns out the balance of production of the shell and what it sequesters is not favorable. It's slightly negative. So it takes a little more CO2 and metabolism to produce the shell than the shell actually sequesters. So that didn't work out.
What's the ideal water temperature to grow healthy and happy oysters?
Above freezing. The best is probably around 70 degrees, 80 degrees. But, you know, our coldest water temperature is probably in the 50s the last few years. I've worked in the water when it was 40, and that's chilly. Of course, you're in a wetsuit or something like that, protected, but it's about an hour, your feet start to get numb. But we have good growing season, no question about it. We can grow a 3-inch oyster in 12 to 18 months.
Fantastic. What are the most significant environmental threats to oysters and the seafood industry?
Well, we have Mother Nature. It's farming, don't forget. And so when the rains come and the salinity goes down, when the red tides come and you can't harvest, it doesn't hurt. The red tide does not hurt the oyster. It makes it you can't eat it until they get washed out. So we have environmental threats like that. And I would suppose that some activities, dredging, that sort of thing, could pose a problem. And I'd like to see some research done on that issue, because when the dredging happens, it turns up sediment from deeper down, which could be anything. It could be toxins. It could be anything. And so if we could get some research to see what toxins are in that and whether or not it's going to harm an oyster operation, that would be useful.
Okay. And what do you see as the Nature Conservancy's role in protecting the oyster industry?
Well, for the coastal area, it's preserving what's on land preserves what's in the water. And we're in a very, very fortunate position where we are in Sandy Bay, because there's very little upland activity that would be deleterious. Plus the water comes off the coastal upland down into a coastal plain and spends time going through a swamp before it actually gets into the bay. And there's a cleansing effect that happens there. So anything you're doing on land to conserve, the land, and to take it out of, commercial production helps the water quality.
And 1 second. Ralph has raised a hand. Let me see if I can get Ralph unmuted.
Am I unmuted now?
There you are.
Yeah. Hey, sorry, I came in a little late because I had some technical difficulty. So you may have already answered this. How did you pick that location to site your oyster farm?
Because I live there.
So that's actually your property there? Or?
Yes. Well,
Okay.
and they're in Marsh Island over toward the Mississippi line, about probably less than a mile from where I am. There are natural reefs there, and there are oysters growing on my pilings in my pier. So it's a good place to raise oysters.
Okay. Now, somebody else wants to start an oyster farm but doesn't live there. How do they go about doing that? Do they have to have property access to the bay there, or how would that work?
Well, you call the principal of Alma Bryant High School and tell them you want a 2-acre plot in their oyster park, which is in the same area where I am. And you go through training at the Auburn University Shellfish Laboratory. You take a year's training, and after that, you get to keep the oysters you've grown. They provide all the gear. So after you've gone through the training, you sell your oysters, and then you have to, I don't know, there may be a competition to get an oyster plot if there are too many people asking for a spot, or maybe a drawing. But you can lease a 2-acre plot. I think it probably runs, the $250, $260 an acre, something like that. So $500 a year. And I think I don't know what the approval process is for a site that's already been set up and approved. You may not have to go through anything, but it's operated by by Alma Brown High School.
Interesting.
You can also apply for a lease, from the state and to use state.
Right. Interesting. Thank you.
Okay. Well, since I'm not seeing any other questions and we've gone just a little bit over our normal time, I think that we're going to wrap it up.
Jessica?
Yes.
Let me end with saying, if anybody wants to visit us, we've about got our 600-foot pier redecked from the storms. So if you want to come down, just give me a call and we'll set it up.
Oh, that's fantastic.
I told Steve that Mary Kate and I would help organize a trip down to his site. So let's get some names to Jessica. We'll organize a trip for everyone.
Great.
You can all reach out to me at philanthropy.alabama@tnc.org. Just let me know you want to go visit Point of Pines Oysters, and we will see what we can organize. And if you'll give me just one moment. All right. Well, thank you so much to Judy, to Judy and to Steve. Steve, thank you so much for taking the time out. You're busy, you're traveling, and you still took the time to do this for us. Thank you so much. And Judy, you're always awesome. And I know that you're always going to be there for me for one of these nature calls to make it great. I want to thank everyone for attending. And finally, no matter what is happening in the world, our work continues uninterrupted. Conservation never stops. And we need your support to keep our conservationists out in the field doing important work for people and nature. So please donate to the Nature Conservancy in Alabama. It's easy. You can send us a brief email at philanthropy.alabama@tnc.org, and we will reply with a link for an online donation or a guide for how you can send your donation via mail. And we thank you in advance for making your tax-deductible financial contribution. And just to let you know, we're going to put Nature Calls on a brief hiatus right now as we head into summer for summer break. But as soon as we have our next Nature Calls scheduled, we will send out an invitation to everyone, and feel free to share it with anyone else in your contact list, or to let us know if there's someone you think would like to receive an invite from us. And thank you again so much, everyone, for joining us for Nature Calls.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Thank you. We'll see you down at Steve's farm.